Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I've gotten a couple of comments recently from viewers wanting to know why, with our core tackle products, we're using a single wire weed guard over some of the traditional bristle style weed guards. So I wanted to address that today because I think there are a lot of major advantages to a single wire weed guard. Before I get into that, though, I want to give you a little background story on why I started doing this. I've always been a giant swim jig fan. I've been using them for years upon years. At this point, like if you grow up in Wisconsin, a swim jig is kind of a staple, it's a way of life. Whether you're fishing natural grass filled lakes or you're fishing any of the shallow rivers from the Mississippi River to the Wisconsin River, a swim jig is just a critical part of your arsenal. And I had one day I remember fishing where I ended up losing like the first 4 or 5 fish that I hooked, and it was really frustrating. And it was one of those tournaments where you didn't get many bites. And I remember by like halfway through the day, I had had those 4 or 5 bites. I'd lost every one of them. And I just was really evaluating the swim jig that I was using. I was doing everything from pulling strands out to trimming the skirt down to fanning the skirt out. I was really trying to figure out ways to allow myself to get better hookups. And after that tournament, I went home, and one of the things that I did is I actually removed the weed guards from several baits because in that tournament, what I actually ended up doing was removing the weed guard altogether and fishing it bare, fishing it with no weed guard. And I ended up catching like my last 5 or 6 bites that I had in that tournament. So when I went home that day, I took the weed guard out and I started looking at it going, what can I do? There were a couple other jigs that I kind of liked on the market that had a single wire weed guard. So I actually started taking a single wire weed guard and epoxying it into the place where the bristle was, because the issue with that was your hole in the heads of most swim jigs are wider for a bristle weed guard versus a single wire weed guard. So I actually was taking pieces of wire and then I'd have to like strategically place it. I actually had a little mold where I had it was styrofoam, and I would put the head and it would balance just right in there, and I would balance the weed guard exactly where I wanted to go because of the epoxy that was in there. I had a big open gap. So the reality is I started actually making swim jigs with a single wire weed guard. So when I got the opportunity with Core Tackle, I said I'm making it with a single wire weed guard because that's what I like. So there's a couple of things I want to point out here because there are that's kind of a unique thing to swim jigs and jigs. There are some jigs that have it, and if you're familiar with Johnny Schultz, the other owner of Core Tackle, he's got that offshore jig with Jewel that's got wire weed guards, and we both really like them. Now the key to this is, well, it's a couple of reasons. One, and most importantly, your hookup percentage is going to be much better when you're just talking about one single wire. If you're talking about a bristle weed guard, there's a couple of things that come into play. First, they're stiffer. There's also more bristles, which can occasionally, especially if you're using a sharp hook, get caught on the hook point. And from that standpoint, it actually prevents you from penetrating the fish's mouth. And more importantly, you just have to push all of the weed guard down on the hook set. Now, depending on what the situation is, in some instances that doesn't affect the hook set. In other instances, it very much can prevent you from getting a good hook set. So with the wire weed guard, you don't have that issue. You just push the weed guard down, you get great hookups, and you also tend to lose less fish because with a wire weed guard, when it gets pushed down, it stays down. One of the issues with a bristle weed guard, and I've seen some very large fish get lost because of this, is if you take tension off your rod when you're fighting a fish, those weed guards, which are pushed down, continue to push back up. So they have a lot more memory. They'll actually back the hook out of the fish if you take tension off your rod. With a wire weed guard, you don't have to worry about that. It'll actually get bent down. So after each fish catch, you bend it back up into position. The other main reason why wire, in my opinion, is so much more important is because it displaces less water. So when you're fishing this bait through the water column, you don't have to pull a full bristle weed guard through the water column. What that means is this bait cuts through the water better, And when you have good rolling motion, like this core tackle one does based on the weight transfer, and if you've got a boot tail, this bait will rock side to side much better than a bristle weed guard one, because the bristle weed guard is much wider, and therefore you have to displace more water to get it to move back and forth. So you get much, much better motion out of a bait that's got a wire weed guard. The whole logic behind that is you just have to move less water, which gives the bait better ability to move. In my opinion, that's very, very important. The last big reason why I think the wire weed guard is better is simply because it looks more natural. You don't have a big bristle weed guard. You have a weed guard that tends to get lost more in the skirt than you do with the bristle weed guard. So from that standpoint, I think it's better. I think if you have a bait that looks more realistic, you tend to get more bites. Now, I know there's a couple of negatives as well to this. The first is really the fact that they're not as weedless as a bristle weed guard. So if you're fishing it around really heavy wood cover, they tend to not come through that wood as good. They still very much are. You just have to be more aware as an angler that you're going to be able to get this bait through that cover. So if you know you're coming through wood, you'll be able to work it through the wood. If you bump a piece of wood that you didn't know was there, you tend to think that's a bite. You're going to set the hook, and you're probably going to get the hook caught or the bait caught. In that situation, I'm willing to take that chance because I'd rather have better hookup percentage and get stuck a few more times throughout the day. Personal preference. The other key here is if you have a wire weed guard that tends to stick up too far, I do think at times, and that's the same with a bristle weed guard, that those bristles can catch on the fish's mouth as they're sucking it in and actually prevent you from that bait getting sucked in, which is why our swim jigs come standard with that 90-degree bend to run parallel to the hook shank. That means you take away that point sticking up, and that's going to come right through the fish's mouth just clean like that. So that really limits a lot of that issue that people have had with a standard wire weed guard. But in my opinion, the wire weed guard is a much, much better way to go because you get increased action out of your bait. You get much better hookups. You'll lose less fish. And at the same time, it looks more natural. So from that standpoint, that's really why we went with it. For years, I've been putting wire weed guards in my swim jigs, and now I have the opportunity to bring them and make them standard or make them stock with them. So I'm going to do it. I really do think it makes a big difference. So hopefully that answers the questions that I've gotten, because I have gotten a handful of questions regarding that. And I really think if you give it a try with any of your baits, not just our swim jig, but if you try a jig or you try some other like swim bait heads that have wire weed guards, you'll find that you tend to get much better hookup percentage out of them for all the reasons that I just mentioned. So anyways, guys, thanks for watching. I appreciate all the continued support. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.